Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, where we dive deep into the books that shape minds and change lives. You know what? The fact that you're here, choosing to spend your time with Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, says something remarkable about you. While millions are scrolling through endless feeds or binge-watching their latest obsession, you've made a different choice. You've decided to invest in something deeper, in understanding yourself, in growing, in grappling with ideas that actually matter. That's not common, and it's not easy, but it's exactly what separates those who drift through life from those who actively shape it. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life isn't just another self-help book. It's a philosophical roadmap through chaos, written by someone who understands both the darkness of human existence and the profound responsibility we each carry. The book has been endorsed by some of the most thoughtful minds of our time, and it's sold over 5 million copies worldwide, resonating with readers from Silicon Valley executives to college students searching for meaning. Peterson himself is a clinical psychologist who spent decades studying the deepest questions of human nature: why we suffer, how we find meaning, what it takes to stand up straight in a world that often feels like it's falling apart. He wrote this book after years of clinical practice, watching people struggle with depression, anxiety, and the fundamental question of how to live a meaningful life. His own battles with illness and personal darkness informed every page. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. A clinical psychologist's unflinching guide to finding meaning in chaos, responsibility in freedom, and strength in vulnerability. 12 ancient principles for navigating the complexity of modern life. Jordan Peterson spent decades as a clinical psychologist and professor, witnessing humanity's deepest struggles firsthand. After battling his own darkness and watching countless patients grapple with meaninglessness, he distilled the most powerful principles for living into this philosophical masterpiece. Picture this. You're walking into a room full of strangers. Maybe it's a job interview, a first date, or just a crowded coffee shop. What's the first thing people notice about you before you even open your mouth? It's your posture. Jordan Peterson opens his 12 rules with something so fundamental, so basic, that we often overlook its profound power. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Now you might be thinking, really? That's life advice. My grandmother told me that when I was 7. But Peterson isn't just talking about good manners here. He's uncovering something much deeper about the architecture of confidence and how the way we carry ourselves literally rewires our brains and reshapes our destiny. Let's start with lobsters. Yes, you heard that right, lobsters. Peterson takes us deep into the ocean to understand something crucial about hierarchy and dominance. When lobsters fight for territory, the winner stands tall, spreads wide, and occupies space with confidence. The loser shrinks, hunches over, and scurries away to the shadows. Here's where it gets fascinating. Their brain chemistry actually changes based on their posture and social position. The dominant lobster gets a surge of serotonin, while the defeated one's levels plummet. Now think about this. Lobsters have been around for over 350 million years, and humans share this same basic neurological wiring. When you slouch, when you make yourself small, when you look at the ground instead of meeting someone's gaze, you're sending the same chemical signals to your brain that say, I'm at the bottom of the hierarchy. Your serotonin drops, your confidence crumbles, and you actually become less capable of handling life's challenges. But here's the beautiful part. It works in reverse too. When you straighten your spine, pull back those shoulders, and lift your chin, you're not just pretending to be confident. You're biochemically becoming more confident. Your brain reads these physical signals and responds by flooding your system with the neurochemicals of success. It's like having a direct hotline to your own confidence center. Peterson tells the story of a client who came to him completely defeated by life. This person walked with hunched shoulders, avoided eye contact, and seemed to apologize for taking up space in the world. Through therapy, Peterson helped them understand that their posture wasn't just reflecting their inner state, it was creating it. As this person began to literally stand taller, their entire life began to transform. They started getting better responses from people, felt more capable in challenging situations, and began to see possibilities where they once saw only obstacles. Think about the last time you felt really confident about something. Maybe you just gotten great news, achieved a goal, or received genuine praise. How did you carry yourself in that moment? I bet you weren't slouching. You probably walked a little taller, made more eye contact, took up a bit more space. That wasn't just a side effect of feeling good. It was part of the mechanism that kept those good feelings flowing. This creates what Peterson calls an upward spiral. Good posture leads to better brain chemistry, which leads to more confident behavior, which leads to better responses from others, which reinforces your sense of competence and worth. People start treating you with more respect not because they've consciously decided you deserve it, but because something deep in their primitive brain recognizes the signals of someone who belongs at the top of the hierarchy. In our modern world, this ancient wisdom has never been more relevant. We spend hours hunched over screens, curled up on couches, walking with our heads down staring at phones. We're literally training our brains to feel defeated and small. But here's what's remarkable. You can start changing this pattern right now, in this very moment, just by adjusting how you hold your body. Peterson isn't suggesting you become arrogant or domineering. This isn't about putting others down to lift yourself up. It's about taking responsibility for the space you occupy in the world and signaling to yourself and others that you have a right to be here, that you have something valuable to contribute. The next time you're facing a challenge, whether it's asking for a raise, having a difficult conversation, or just walking into a room where you don't know anyone, remember the lobsters. Remember that your posture is sending messages not just to everyone around you, but to the most important audience of all, your own brain. Stand up straight, pull those shoulders back, and step forward into your life with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong exactly where you are. This first rule sets the foundation for everything that follows, because until you can embody confidence in your very bones, all the other life advice in the world remains just words on a page. Picture this scene for a moment. Your beloved dog limps up to you, clearly in pain, maybe favoring one paw. What do? Without hesitation, you're probably calling the vet, researching symptoms online, maybe even considering an emergency visit regardless of the cost. You'd move heaven and earth to help this creature you care about. Now flip the script. You've been having that nagging pain in your back for weeks, maybe months. You keep telling yourself it's nothing, that you'll deal with it later, that you don't have time for a doctor's visit. You push through, ignore it, maybe pop some over-the-counter pills and hope it goes away. This stark contrast reveals something profound about human nature that Jordan Peterson explores in his second rule for life. We have this remarkable ability to care deeply for others, while treating ourselves with a kind of casual neglect that borders on cruelty. It's as if we've appointed ourselves as the least important person in our own lives. Peterson opens this discussion by pointing to a fascinating statistic that most people don't know. When doctors prescribe medication for pets, the compliance rate is significantly higher than when they prescribe the same medications for the pet's owners. Think about that for a moment. We're more likely to make sure our dog takes their antibiotics than we are to take our own. We'll research the best food for our cat's dietary needs while grabbing fast food for lunch 3 days in a row. This isn't just about physical health, though that's where it becomes most visible. It's about a fundamental relationship we have with ourselves, one that's often characterized by harsh criticism, impossible standards, and a kind of internal tyranny that we'd never inflict on someone we cared about. When your friend makes a mistake, you're probably quick to offer compassion, understanding, maybe even practical help. When you make the same mistake, that internal voice turns into a prosecutor, judge, and jury all rolled into one. Peterson traces this pattern back to some deep psychological and even biblical roots. He suggests that we've somehow learned to see ourselves as fundamentally flawed, undeserving, or simply less important than others. It's as if we've internalized the idea that self-care is selfish, that putting ourselves first is morally wrong, that we should always be last in line for our own attention and care. But here's where Peterson's insight becomes revolutionary. He argues that this isn't actually virtuous or helpful to anyone. When you neglect yourself, when you fail to take care of your basic needs, when you treat yourself poorly, you're not becoming a better person. You're becoming a worse one. You're less capable of helping others, less present in relationships, less effective in your work, and ultimately less able to contribute positively to the world around you. Consider the airplane safety instruction we've all heard countless times. Put your own oxygen mask on first before helping others. This isn't selfishness, it's wisdom. If you pass out from lack of oxygen, you can't help anyone. The same principle applies to life more broadly. If you're running on empty, if you're neglecting your health, your growth, your fundamental needs, you're actually doing a disservice to everyone who depends on you. Peterson suggests we need to fundamentally reimagine our relationship with ourselves. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who deserves whatever scraps are left over after everyone else has been taken care of, try seeing yourself as someone you're responsible for helping. Imagine you've been put in charge of caring for someone precious, someone with potential, someone who deserves the same consideration you'd give to your best friend or beloved family member. This shift in perspective changes everything. Suddenly, making sure you get enough sleep isn't lazy, it's responsible stewardship. Taking time to eat properly isn't indulgent, it's basic maintenance. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's protecting someone valuable. Pursuing your goals and dreams isn't narcissistic, it's helping someone reach their potential. Now, think about this practically. What would change in your daily routine if you treated yourself like someone you were genuinely responsible for helping? You'd probably make sure that person got regular exercise, ate decent food, had meaningful relationships, pursued interesting challenges, and had time for rest and reflection. You'd encourage them when they failed, celebrate their victories, and help them learn from their mistakes rather than beating them up over every imperfection. Peterson isn't advocating for unlimited self-indulgence or narcissistic self-obsession. He's talking about basic respect, care, and responsibility. He's suggesting that the voice in your head should sound more like a good coach or caring mentor, and less like a harsh critic or demanding taskmaster. This rule challenges us to examine the stories we tell ourselves about what we deserve and what constitutes proper self-care. It asks us to consider whether our current approach to ourselves is actually serving anyone well, and whether a little more self-compassion might not make us better friends, partners, parents, and contributors to our communities. The transformation begins with recognizing that you are someone worth helping, someone deserving of the same care and attention you'd readily give to others. Picture this. You're sitting at your kitchen table with your morning coffee, scrolling through your phone, and you see yet another post from that friend who always seems to be in some kind of drama. You know the one. Every conversation somehow turns into a complaint session. Every achievement of yours gets met with subtle undermining, and somehow, after spending time with them, you always feel a little more drained, a little less optimistic about your own life. Now, here's the question that Peterson poses in Rule 3 that might make you uncomfortable. What if the problem isn't just them, but the fact that you keep choosing to surround yourself with people like this? Welcome back to our journey through Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. I'm your host, and today we're diving into Rule 3. Make friends with people who want the best for you. This isn't just about being picky with your social circle. It's about understanding something fundamental about human nature and personal growth that most of us learn the hard way. Peterson starts this rule with a story that hits close to home for many of us. He talks about a friend from his youth, someone he genuinely cared about but who consistently made destructive choices. Despite Peterson's attempts to help, despite the interventions and the conversations and the genuine concern, this friend kept spiraling downward. The painful realization that Peterson had to face was this: sometimes people don't want to be saved, and your attempts to rescue them might actually be enabling their descent rather than helping their ascent. Think about this for a moment. How many times have you found yourself in a relationship, whether romantic, friendship, or even family, where you're constantly trying to pull someone up while they seem determined to pull you down? Peterson argues that this isn't just emotionally exhausting. It's actually a form of self-sabotage disguised as virtue. Here's where it gets really interesting, and perhaps a bit controversial. Peterson suggests that we often choose troubled friends not out of pure altruism, but because being around people who are doing worse than us makes us feel better about our own lives. It's easier to feel successful next to someone who's failing than it is to feel successful next to someone who's thriving. But here's the catch. This false sense of superiority comes at a tremendous cost to your own potential for growth. Imagine your social circle as a garden. If you plant healthy seeds next to weeds, what happens? The weeds don't magically become flowers, but the flowers might struggle to reach their full potential because they're competing for nutrients and sunlight with plants that aren't contributing to the garden's overall health. Your energy, your time, your emotional resources, these are finite. When you consistently invest them in relationships that drain rather than nourish, you're essentially choosing to limit your own growth. Now, this doesn't mean Peterson is advocating for abandoning people the moment they hit a rough patch. Life is messy, and everyone goes through difficult periods. The crucial distinction he makes is between people who are temporarily struggling but genuinely want to improve their situation, and people who seem committed to their own destruction and want to drag you along for the ride. Consider the friend who calls you at midnight, drunk and crying about the same problems they refuse to address during daylight hours. Compare that to the friend who calls you to say they're struggling with something and asks for your honest advice about how to move forward. The first person wants you to be an audience for their suffering. The second person wants you to be a partner in their growth. Can you feel the difference? Peterson argues that surrounding yourself with people who genuinely want the best for you creates an upward spiral in your life. These are people who celebrate your successes without jealousy, who challenge you to be better without tearing you down, and who support you during difficult times while still holding you accountable for your choices. They're the friends who tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable, because they care more about your long-term well-being than your short-term comfort. In our hyper-connected world, this wisdom feels more relevant than ever. Social media makes it easy to maintain relationships that would naturally fade, keeping us tethered to people who might not have our best interests at heart. We're constantly exposed to other people's curated highlight reels, making it tempting to surround ourselves with people whose lives make us feel better about our own by comparison. But here's what Peterson understands about human psychology. We become like the people we spend time with. Their habits, their attitudes, their ways of thinking about problems and opportunities, all of this rubs off on us whether we realize it or not. Choose friends who are moving upward in life, and you'll find yourself naturally adopting the mindset and behaviors that create upward momentum. Choose friends who are stuck in patterns of blame, victimhood, and self-destruction, and you'll find those patterns creeping into your own thinking. This rule challenges us to be honest about our relationships and brave enough to make difficult choices. It asks us to value our own potential enough to protect it from people who would diminish it, even if those people are charming or familiar or claim to need us. As we move forward in our exploration of Peterson's rules, remember this. Choosing better friends isn't just about improving your social life. It's about taking responsibility for the trajectory of your entire existence. Picture this. You're scrolling through social media at 2 in the morning, and suddenly you're hit with that familiar wave of inadequacy. There's your high school classmate posting photos from their European vacation, your college friend announcing their promotion to VP, and your neighbor showing off their perfectly organized home renovation. Sound familiar? We've all been there, caught in what Peterson calls the comparison trap, and let me tell you, it's one of the most soul-crushing habits we've developed in our modern world. Here's the thing that Jordan Peterson understood so clearly when he wrote about this fourth rule. When you compare yourself to others, you're not just setting yourself up for disappointment, you're actually engaging in a fundamentally flawed exercise. Think about it for a moment. When you look at someone else's life, what are you really seeing? You're seeing their highlight reel, their best moments, their carefully curated successes. But when you look at your own life, you see everything. The messy behind-the-scenes reality, the struggles, the failures, the moments of doubt that nobody else witnesses. Peterson tells us something profound here. The only person you should be comparing yourself to is who you were yesterday. Not your neighbor, not your coworker, not some influencer on Instagram, but you, from 24 hours ago. This isn't just feel-good advice. This is practical wisdom that can transform how you approach personal growth. Now think about this. Why do we fall into the comparison trap so easily? Part of it is evolutionary. Our brains are wired to assess our position in social hierarchies because, for thousands of years, knowing where you stood in the group could mean the difference between life and death. But here's where it gets interesting, and where Peterson's insight really shines. In our modern world, we're not just comparing ourselves to the 50 or 100 people in our immediate tribe. We're comparing ourselves to millions of people across the globe, thanks to social media and mass communication. Imagine you're a pretty decent guitar player in your small town. You might feel good about your skills until you go on YouTube and watch some 15-year-old prodigy playing pieces that took you years to master. Suddenly, your confidence crumbles. But here's what Peterson would ask you. Has watching that video made you a worse guitar player than you were yesterday? Of course not. Your skills are exactly the same, but your perception of your worth has been damaged by an irrelevant comparison. The beauty of Peterson's approach lies in its simplicity and its focus on what you can actually control. When you compare yourself to who you were yesterday, you're engaging with reality in a much more honest way. You know your starting point intimately. You know what challenges you faced, what obstacles you overcame, and what small victories you achieved. This kind of comparison is not only fair, it's actually useful for growth. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. Peterson talks about people who are struggling with addiction or severe depression. For someone in that situation, getting out of bed might be a genuine achievement. If they compared themselves to someone running a marathon that day, they'd feel hopeless. But if they compare themselves to who they were yesterday, when they couldn't even manage to shower, then getting dressed and making breakfast becomes a real victory worth celebrating. This principle applies to all of us, not just those facing major challenges. Maybe yesterday you were impatient with your children, and today you took a deep breath and responded calmly to their questions. That's growth. Maybe yesterday you avoided a difficult conversation at work, and today you found the courage to address the issue directly. That's progress. These might seem like small things when compared to someone else's major life achievements, but they're your achievements, built on your foundation, moving you forward on your unique path. Peterson emphasizes that this approach requires you to pay attention to your own life in a way that many people simply don't. It means taking stock of where you are, honestly assessing your strengths and weaknesses, and then making deliberate choices about how to improve. It's harder work than scrolling through social media and feeling either superior or inferior to others, but it's infinitely more rewarding. The practical application of this rule extends into every area of life. In your career, instead of constantly looking at what others have achieved, Focus on developing your skills incrementally. In relationships, work on being a slightly better partner, parent, or friend than you were the day before. In health, celebrate the small improvements in your habits rather than comparing your fitness level to someone who's been training for years. What makes this rule so powerful is that it's completely within your control and it never stops being relevant. There will always be someone richer, more successful, more talented, or more attractive than you. But there will also always be an opportunity to be better than you were yesterday. That's a game you can actually win, one small step at a time. Picture this. You're at a restaurant trying to enjoy a quiet dinner with friends, when suddenly a small tornado disguises itself as a 4-year-old and begins terrorizing nearby tables. The parents, they're sitting there with weak smiles, shrugging apologetically while doing absolutely nothing to stop their little hurricane. You watch this unfold, and something inside you recoils. This isn't about being judgmental. It's about witnessing what happens when children are allowed to do things that make even their own parents secretly dislike them. Jordan Peterson's fifth rule cuts straight to the heart of one of modern parenting's most uncomfortable truths. We live in an era where setting boundaries for children has somehow become controversial, where discipline is often confused with abuse, and where many parents seem terrified of their own offspring. But here's what Peterson understood that many of us have forgotten. When you fail to teach your children how to behave in ways that make them likable, you're not being kind, you're being cruel. Think about this for a moment. What happens to a child who never learns that their actions have consequences? What becomes of a kid who grows up believing the world revolves around their immediate desires? Peterson argues that such children become small tyrants, and eventually, they become adult tyrants that nobody wants to be around. The parents who think they're being loving by avoiding all conflict are actually setting their children up for a lifetime of social rejection and personal misery. Now, this doesn't mean Peterson advocates for harsh, authoritarian parenting. Far from it. He's talking about something much more sophisticated, the art of teaching children to regulate themselves so they can function successfully in the world. Consider how a good parent operates. They don't crush their child's spirit, but they also don't let their child crush everyone else's spirit either. It's about finding that delicate balance between nurture and structure. Peterson shares a particularly striking observation about how children test boundaries. He describes how a child will push and push against limits, not because they want unlimited freedom, but because they desperately want to know where the edges are. It's like they're asking, how far can I go before someone who loves me cares enough to stop me? When parents fail to provide those boundaries, children often escalate their behavior, becoming increasingly difficult until someone finally intervenes. The tragedy is that by then, the intervention often comes from teachers, police, or other authorities who don't love the child at all. Here's where Peterson's insights become especially relevant in our current moment. We're raising children in a world that's more complex and demanding than ever before. The social skills that were once learned naturally in large families and tight-knit communities now have to be deliberately taught. A child who throws tantrums might have been corrected by any number of adults in previous generations, but today's children often interact primarily with their immediate family members who may be too exhausted, too guilty, or too confused about their role to provide consistent guidance. The consequences extend far beyond childhood. Peterson points out that children who never learn to make themselves pleasant to be around struggle enormously as adults. They have difficulty maintaining relationships, holding jobs, or navigating social situations. They've never developed what he calls social propriety, the ability to read a room, understand social cues, and adjust their behavior accordingly. In essence, their parents' failure to discipline them becomes society's problem. But here's the deeper wisdom in Peterson's approach. Disciplining children isn't really about punishment, it's about love. When you care enough about a child to endure their temporary displeasure in service of their long-term development, you're demonstrating the highest form of parental love. You're saying, I love you enough to help you become someone that other people will want to be around, someone who can succeed in life, someone who can form meaningful relationships. Peterson also addresses the guilt many modern parents feel about setting limits. We've somehow convinced ourselves that good parents never make their children unhappy, never say no, never enforce consequences. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what children need. Children actually feel more secure, not less, when they know their parents are strong enough to contain their worst impulses and guide them toward better choices. The rule ultimately asks us to consider what we owe our children beyond mere survival and comfort. We owe them the skills, habits, and character traits that will serve them throughout their lives. This means teaching them to be considerate, resilient, and socially competent qualities that can only be developed through practice, correction, and yes, sometimes disappointment. As we move deeper into Peterson's 12 rules, we'll see how this foundation of proper child-rearing connects to larger themes about responsibility, meaning, and the courage required to live well in a challenging world. Picture this. You're scrolling through social media, and you see someone posting angry rants about how broken the world is, how corrupt politicians are ruining everything, how society needs a complete overhaul. But here's the thing that might make you pause and think differently about all this righteous anger. What if I told you that the person behind that passionate post hasn't cleaned their room in weeks, can't maintain a healthy relationship, struggles to show up on time for work, and has a mountain of personal problems they refuse to address? This brings us to one of Peterson's most provocative and practical rules. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Now, before you think this sounds harsh or dismissive of genuine social concerns, let me walk you through why this principle is actually one of the most compassionate and effective approaches to creating real change. Peterson isn't saying we should ignore injustice or never speak up about problems we see around us. What he's suggesting is something far more nuanced and ultimately more powerful. Think about it this way. When we focus obsessively on fixing the world's problems while our own lives are in chaos, we're essentially trying to perform surgery with dirty hands. We might have good intentions, but we're likely to cause more harm than good. There's something almost intoxicating about grand crusades and sweeping social movements, because they allow us to feel important and righteous, while conveniently avoiding the much harder work of examining our own flaws and taking responsibility for our own small corner of existence. Peterson shares a story that really drives this point home. He talks about the Columbine shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who were consumed with hatred for what they saw as a corrupt and meaningless world. They positioned themselves as righteous agents of change, justified in their violence because society was so fundamentally broken. But here's what's chilling. They couldn't even manage their own basic responsibilities as students and community members. Their rooms were disasters, their relationships were toxic, and their personal lives were complete chaos. Yet somehow they felt qualified to judge and punish the entire world. Now, this is an extreme example, but the underlying pattern shows up everywhere in less dramatic ways. How many times have you encountered someone who's constantly complaining about their boss, their government, their community, but when you look at their personal life, they can't stick to a budget, they're chronically late. They don't follow through on commitments to friends and family, and they blame everyone else for their problems. Here's where this gets really interesting from a psychological perspective. When we're overwhelmed by our own personal chaos, focusing on external problems actually serves as a psychological defense mechanism. It's much easier to point fingers at abstract systems and distant politicians than it is to admit that maybe, just maybe, we need to work on ourselves first. Peterson calls this the mote and beam problem, referencing the biblical passage about removing the log from your own eye before worrying about the speck in your brother's eye. But let's make this practical and modern. What does setting your house in order actually look like in today's world? It means taking an honest inventory of your life. Are you treating the people closest to you with respect and kindness? Are you reliable and trustworthy in your commitments? Are you managing your finances responsibly? Are you taking care of your physical and mental health? Are you contributing positively to your immediate community, your workplace, your family? Think about this. If you can't figure out how to have a healthy conversation with your roommate about dirty dishes, what makes you think you're qualified to solve complex societal issues that involve millions of people with different backgrounds, motivations, and constraints? If you can't manage to be punctual for your own commitments, why should anyone trust your grand plans for reorganizing society? Now, here's where Peterson's insight becomes really profound. He argues that when you do start getting your own life in order, something remarkable happens. You begin to understand how difficult change really is, even on a small scale. You develop genuine empathy for other people's struggles because you've wrestled with your own. You become more humble about the complexity of human behavior and social systems. And paradoxically, this makes you far more effective when you do engage with larger issues. The person who has successfully created order in their own life, who has learned to take responsibility for their actions and their circumstances, brings a completely different energy to social activism. They're not driven by resentment or the need to feel superior. They're motivated by genuine compassion, and they have practical experience in actually making positive changes happen. Peterson isn't advocating for selfish withdrawal from social engagement. He's advocating for what we might call earned authority. When you speak from a place of personal integrity and demonstrated competence in your own sphere, people listen differently. Your words carry weight because they're backed up by a life that reflects your values. So before you post that angry comment about how the world needs to change, take a moment to ask yourself, what small step could I take today to bring more order, responsibility, and genuine care into my own immediate environment? Because that's where real transformation begins, one person, one choice, one clean room at a time. You know, we've all been there. It's Friday night, you're exhausted from the week, and Netflix is calling your name. The dishes can wait until tomorrow, that project you've been putting off can survive another weekend. And hey, those cookies in the kitchen aren't going to eat themselves. It feels good in the moment, doesn't it? But Sunday evening rolls around, and suddenly you're hit with that familiar wave of regret and anxiety. This is the exact tension Jordan Peterson explores in his 7th rule. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Now think about this for a moment. What's the difference between what feels good right now and what actually makes your life better? Peterson argues that we're living in an age where we've confused pleasure with meaning, and frankly, it's making us miserable. He tells us that expedience is like junk food for the soul. It tastes great going down, but it leaves you hungry, unsatisfied, and often worse off than when you started. Peterson draws on a fascinating story from his clinical practice. He had a client, a young man who spent his days playing video games, ordering takeout, and avoiding any real responsibility. The guy was technically free, right? No one was forcing him to do anything difficult. He could sleep in, eat whatever he wanted, and spend hours in virtual worlds where he was a hero. But here's the kicker, he was absolutely miserable. Depression had settled over him like a thick fog, and he couldn't understand why. After all, he was doing exactly what he wanted to do. This is where Peterson's insight becomes crystal clear. The young man was pursuing what was expedient, the path of least resistance, the quick dopamine hits, the immediate gratification. But meaning, that was nowhere to be found. Meaning, Peterson explains, comes from taking on responsibility, from voluntarily accepting the burden of making things better, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Think of it this way. Imagine you're walking through a forest and you come to a fork in the path. One trail is smooth, downhill, and easy. You can practically skip along it. The other is rocky, steep, and demanding. Your legs will burn, you'll work up a sweat, and there might be obstacles to navigate. Most of us, if we're honest, would prefer the easy path. But here's what Peterson discovered through years of research and clinical work. The people who choose the difficult path, who climb that metaphorical mountain, are the ones who find their lives filled with purpose and satisfaction. Now, this doesn't mean Peterson is advocating for unnecessary suffering or telling us to make life harder just for the sake of it. He's talking about something much more sophisticated. He's talking about the difference between the sacrifice that leads somewhere meaningful and the sacrifice that's just pointless pain. When you choose to wake up early to exercise instead of hitting the snooze button, when you have that difficult conversation with your partner instead of avoiding conflict, when you work on that creative project that scares you instead of scrolling through social media, these are meaningful sacrifices. Peterson uses the metaphor of delayed gratification, but he takes it deeper than the famous marshmallow experiment. He's not just talking about waiting for 2 marshmallows instead of eating one now. He's talking about trading the marshmallows entirely for something that will nourish you in ways that sugar never could. It's like choosing to plant a garden instead of buying cut flowers. The flowers look beautiful immediately, but the garden will feed you for seasons to come. Consider how this plays out in modern relationships. The expedient choice might be to avoid difficult conversations, to keep things surface level and pleasant. But meaningful relationships require you to dive into the messy, complicated stuff. They require vulnerability, honest communication, and sometimes uncomfortable growth. The couple that chooses meaning over expedience will argue, yes, but they'll argue about things that matter, and they'll come out stronger on the other side. In our career lives, this principle is equally powerful. The expedient choice might be to take the job that pays well but leaves you feeling empty, or to avoid taking on challenging projects that might risk failure. But Peterson suggests that meaning comes from aligning your work with something larger than yourself, from taking on responsibilities that stretch you and contribute to something worthwhile. What makes this rule particularly relevant today is how our modern world seems designed to pull us toward expedience. Social media gives us instant validation, streaming services provide endless entertainment, and food delivery apps satisfy our hunger within minutes. We're surrounded by opportunities to choose the easy path, the quick fix, the immediate reward. But here's Peterson's profound insight. When we consistently choose expedience over meaning, we're not just missing out on fulfillment. We're actually making our lives harder in the long run. The person who avoids difficult conversations ends up with shallow relationships. The person who chooses comfort over growth ends up stagnant and bitter. The person who prioritizes pleasure over purpose ends up empty and lost. As we move forward in exploring Peterson's rules, remember this fundamental truth. Meaning isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, moment by moment, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. You know how sometimes you catch yourself in a tiny lie, maybe telling your boss you're running late because of traffic when really you just hit snooze one too many times? Well, grab your coffee a little tighter, because Jordan Peterson's 8th rule is about to make you reconsider every small deception you've ever told. Tell the truth, or, at least, don't lie isn't just about being a good person, it's about something far more profound and unsettling. Peterson opens this chapter with a startling claim. Lying doesn't just deceive others, it literally warps reality itself. Now, think about this for a moment. When you lie, you're not just telling someone something false, you're creating a false version of the world that you then have to live in and maintain. It's like building a house on quicksand, and then wondering why everything keeps shifting beneath your feet. The author takes us deep into the mechanics of deception, explaining how lies compound exponentially. Remember the old saying about tangled webs? Peterson shows us exactly how this works in practice. When you tell one lie, you inevitably need more lies to support it. Your colleague asks about that project you claimed to finish but didn't. Now you need another lie. Your partner questions details that don't add up. More deception required. Before you know it, You're living in an elaborate fictional universe that requires constant energy to maintain. But here's where Peterson gets really interesting. He argues that lying isn't just morally wrong, it's practically catastrophic. Think about someone you know who's a chronic liar. Notice how their life tends to be chaotic, how their relationships are unstable, how they seem to lurch from crisis to crisis. That's not coincidence. When you consistently distort truth, you lose the ability to navigate reality effectively. It's like trying to use a broken compass. You'll never reach your destination because your navigation system is fundamentally corrupted. Peterson shares a powerful story about watching someone close to him spiral into increasingly destructive behavior, partly enabled by their willingness to lie to themselves and others about what was happening. The lies weren't malicious. They were often motivated by kindness, by wanting to avoid difficult conversations or spare feelings. But each small deception made the situation worse, like applying tiny bandages to a wound that needed surgery. The person became trapped in a web of their own making, unable to see clearly enough to find a way out. This connects to one of Peterson's most profound insights. We don't just live in reality, we participate in creating it. When you tell the truth, you're aligning yourself with what actually is, which gives you power to work with reality rather than against it. When you lie, you're essentially declaring war on existence itself. You're saying that reality isn't good enough, that it needs to be falsified to be acceptable. Now, think about this in the context of social media, where we curate perfect versions of our lives. Peterson would argue that even these seemingly harmless distortions have consequences. When you consistently present a false version of yourself, you start to lose touch with who you actually are. You begin to believe your own propaganda, and then you're shocked when real life doesn't match the story you've been telling. The chapter gets even more fascinating when Peterson explores the relationship between truth-telling and personal strength. He suggests that people who consistently tell the truth develop a kind of psychological resilience that liars never achieve. Why? Because truth-tellers are constantly confronting reality as it actually is, which builds their capacity to handle difficult situations. Liars, by contrast, are always looking for escape routes, always trying to avoid direct confrontation with problems. Peterson also addresses the common objection. What about white lies, the small social lubricants that make life smoother? His response is nuanced but firm. While he acknowledges that brutal honesty can sometimes be cruel, he argues that most of what we call white lies are actually just cowardice disguised as kindness. We tell our friend their terrible haircut looks great not to spare their feelings, but to avoid the discomfort of a difficult conversation. The practical implications of this rule extend far beyond personal relationships. Peterson connects truth-telling to competence, arguing that organizations and societies that tolerate lies inevitably become less effective. Think about companies where everyone knows certain problems exist, but nobody talks about them openly. These organizations consistently underperform because they can't solve problems they won't acknowledge. As we wrap up this exploration of truth and lies, Peterson leaves us with a challenging thought. Maybe the reason life feels so difficult sometimes isn't because reality is inherently harsh, but because we're constantly fighting against it with our deceptions. When you commit to telling the truth, or at least refusing to lie, you're not just choosing a moral stance, you're choosing to live in the real world rather than a fantasy. And while the real world can be challenging, it's also the only place where genuine solutions and authentic relationships are possible. So the next time you're tempted to tell that small lie, remember, you're not just deceiving someone else, you're choosing to live in fiction rather than reality. Picture this. You're at a dinner party and someone starts talking about a topic you think you know inside and out. Your mind immediately begins formulating your response, crafting the perfect comeback or correction. But here's what Jordan Peterson wants us to consider in his 9th rule for life. What if that person actually knows something you don't? What if, Instead of preparing your rebuttal, you leaned in and truly listened. This might sound almost revolutionary in our age of instant opinions and Twitter debates, but Peterson argues that genuine listening is one of the most powerful tools we have for personal growth and understanding the world around us. Think about it. When was the last time you listened to someone not to respond, but simply to understand? When did you last approach a conversation with the genuine curiosity of a child, rather than the defensive posture of someone protecting their territory of knowledge? Peterson draws from his decades of clinical practice to illustrate this point. In his therapy sessions, he noticed something fascinating. His patients weren't just seeking advice or solutions. They were seeking to be heard, to be understood, to have their experiences validated and explored. But here's the kicker. In the process of truly listening to them, Peterson discovered that he was learning as much as he was teaching. Each person who sat across from him carried unique insights born from their particular struggles, their specific vantage point on life's challenges. Now, think about this for a moment. We live in a world where everyone seems to be an expert on everything. Social media has turned us all into broadcasters of our opinions, but terrible receivers of others' wisdom. We've become like radio stations that only transmit but never tune in to other frequencies. Peterson suggests that this is not just unfortunate, it's actually self-defeating. By assuming we already know what others are going to say, we cut ourselves off from the very information that could help us grow, solve our problems, or see the world more clearly. Consider the story Peterson tells about Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, who had a practice of treating every patient as if they were his teacher. Jung understood that each person's psyche contained mysteries and insights that no textbook could capture. This wasn't false humility or therapeutic technique. It was a genuine recognition that human experience is so vast and varied that no single person, no matter how educated or experienced, could possibly encompass all of its wisdom. But let's bring this down to earth with a modern example. Imagine you're having trouble with your teenager, and your neighbor, someone you've always considered a bit scattered, starts sharing their experience with their own kids. Your first instinct might be to tune out, thinking, "What could this person possibly teach me?" But what if you suspended that judgment? What if you listened with the assumption that their chaotic journey with parenting might contain exactly the insight you need? Peterson argues that this shift in perspective, from knowing to learning, can transform not just our relationships but our entire approach to life. The beauty of this rule extends far beyond formal conversations. It applies to the homeless person who might understand resilience in ways that would humble a motivational speaker. It applies to the child who sees the world with a clarity that adults have trained themselves out of. It applies to your political opponent who might be responding to real concerns that you've never had to face. Each person we encounter is like a book written in a language we don't fully speak, and genuine listening is how we begin to decode their unique wisdom. Peterson also connects this to the ancient concept of the logos, the idea that truth and wisdom are constantly being revealed through dialogue and genuine exchange. When we truly listen, we're not just being polite or therapeutic, we're participating in this ongoing revelation of truth. We're acknowledging that reality is too complex for any one perspective to fully capture, and that wisdom emerges through the collision and combination of different viewpoints. This doesn't mean becoming gullible or accepting everything everyone says as gospel truth. Peterson is clear about this. Listening genuinely doesn't mean abandoning your critical thinking. Instead, it means expanding your capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to extract valuable insights even from flawed or incomplete arguments. It's like being a gold prospector who knows that even in muddy water, there might be precious metal worth extracting. So here's the practical challenge Peterson leaves us with. In your next conversation, try this experiment. Instead of waiting for your turn to speak, instead of mentally preparing your response, Try to understand not just what the person is saying, but why they're saying it. What experiences led them to this conclusion? What fears or hopes are driving their perspective? What might they see that you've missed? You might be surprised by what you discover, not just about them, but about yourself and the world you both inhabit. Picture this scene. You're sitting across from someone you care about, maybe over coffee just like we are right now, and they're clearly struggling with something. They're speaking in circles, using vague words like everything is terrible or nothing ever works out. You want to help, but it's like trying to grab smoke with your bare hands. Peterson would tell you that this person isn't just communicating poorly, they're thinking poorly, and that imprecise language is actually making their problems worse, not better. This brings us to Rule 10, which might seem deceptively simple at first glance. Be precise in your speech. But here's where Peterson gets really interesting, because he's not just talking about being a better communicator. He's arguing that the very act of speaking precisely actually transforms how we think, how we see problems, and ultimately, how we solve them. It's as if language isn't just a tool we use to describe reality. It's the lens through which we create our version of reality. Think about the last time you were really upset about something. Did you find yourself saying things like, "I'm so stressed," or "work is killing me," or "my relationship is a disaster"? Now, Peterson would challenge you here. What exactly are you stressed about? Which specific aspect of work is problematic? What particular pattern in your relationship needs attention? The difference between these two approaches isn't just semantic. It's the difference between drowning in an ocean of overwhelming problems and identifying specific, manageable challenges you can actually address. Peterson shares a powerful story about a client who kept saying her life was falling apart. Session after session, this woman would use these broad, catastrophic terms that made her situation seem hopeless. But when Peterson pressed her to be specific, something fascinating happened. Her falling apart life actually consisted of 3 distinct problems. She was behind on her mortgage payments, her teenage son was skipping school, and she'd been avoiding a difficult conversation with her sister about their mother's care. Suddenly, instead of facing an insurmountable life crisis, she had 3 concrete problems that each had potential solutions. The precision of her language literally changed the nature of her reality. This connects to something profound that Peterson explores about the relationship between chaos and order. When we speak imprecisely, we're essentially allowing chaos to reign in our minds. Vague language creates vague thinking, which leads to vague action, which produces vague results. But precision acts like a spotlight in a dark room. It illuminates exactly what we're dealing with so we can navigate effectively. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. We live in an age of information overload, where we're constantly bombarded with complex problems that seem too big to solve. Climate change, political division, economic uncertainty, these challenges can feel so overwhelming that we retreat into imprecise language and thinking. Everything is broken, we might say, or the world is going crazy. But Peterson argues that this kind of thinking is not just unhelpful, it's actually part of the problem. Now think about this. When was the last time you heard someone articulate a problem with laser-like precision and walk away feeling more confused? It doesn't happen. Precision creates clarity, and clarity creates the possibility for action. This is why Peterson insists that being precise in your speech isn't just about communication. It's about taking responsibility for your own thinking, and by extension, your own life. He uses the metaphor of a surgeon's scalpel. A surgeon doesn't approach a patient with a butter knife, making broad, imprecise cuts and hoping for the best. Every incision is deliberate, specific, and purposeful. Similarly, when we speak precisely about our problems, our goals, and our experiences, we're performing a kind of surgery on chaos itself, carving out manageable pieces that we can actually work with. Peterson also explores how imprecise speech often serves as a form of self-deception. When we say, "I can't," instead of "I won't," or "I don't know how," we're actually hiding from ourselves. When we say people don't like me, instead of identifying specific relationship challenges with particular individuals, we're avoiding the difficult but necessary work of improvement. Precision forces us to confront reality as it actually is, not as we fear it might be or wish it were. This rule has profound implications for how we handle conflict, make decisions, and pursue our goals. Instead of saying, "I want to be successful," precision demands that we define what success looks like specifically. Instead of, "We need to communicate better," we identify exactly which conversations we've been avoiding and why. As we move toward understanding how small changes in how we speak can create massive changes in how we live, remember that precision isn't about perfection. It's about clarity. It's about having the courage to look directly at what is, rather than hiding behind the comfortable fog of imprecise language. In our next exploration, we'll discover how this principle of precision extends beyond language into every aspect of how we engage with life itself. Picture this scene with me for a moment. You're walking through a park on a sunny afternoon, coffee in hand, when you spot a group of teenagers attempting increasingly daring skateboard tricks. Your first instinct might be to wince, maybe even call out a warning about safety gear or suggest they find somewhere less risky to practice. But Jordan Peterson would tell you to pause right there, take a sip of that coffee, and consider something profound that's actually happening before your eyes. This is where we dive into one of Peterson's most counterintuitive rules, one that challenges everything our safety-obsessed culture has taught us about protecting the young. Rule 11 asks us to step back and recognize that when children are skateboarding, when they're taking calculated risks and pushing their boundaries, something essential is happening that we absolutely must not interrupt. Now think about this for a moment. What exactly are those kids on skateboards really doing? On the surface, sure, they're rolling around on wooden boards with wheels, occasionally falling and scraping their knees. But dig deeper, and you'll discover they're engaged in one of the most fundamental human activities imaginable. They're learning to navigate risk, to calibrate their abilities against real consequences, and to develop what Peterson calls competence through voluntary engagement with danger. Peterson argues that our modern obsession with safety has created a dangerous paradox. In our desperate attempt to protect children from every possible harm, we've actually made them more vulnerable to the real dangers of life. When we bubble wrap childhood, when we remove every sharp edge and cushion every fall, we rob young people of the opportunity to develop the very skills they'll need to handle genuine challenges as adults. Consider the difference between a child who's spent years learning to assess risk on a skateboard versus one who's been kept safely indoors, warned constantly about potential dangers. The skateboarder has developed an intuitive understanding of physics, balance, and consequence. They've learned to read their environment, to push their limits incrementally, and most importantly, they've discovered that they can recover from failure. The overprotected child, meanwhile, approaches their first real risk as an adult with no calibrated sense of their own capabilities. Peterson illustrates this with a fascinating observation about playground design. Modern playgrounds, with their rounded edges and safety surfaces, actually produce more injuries than the supposedly dangerous equipment of previous generations. Why? Because children can't properly assess risk when the environment gives them no meaningful feedback. A playground that looks safe but isn't teaches children to trust appearances over reality. A playground that looks challenging but is actually well-designed teaches children to trust their own judgment and abilities. This principle extends far beyond physical risk-taking. When we prevent children from experiencing social rejection, academic failure, or emotional disappointment, we're essentially preventing them from developing psychological resilience. Think about the college student who's never been told no, never failed a test, never been excluded from a group. They arrive at university as psychological infants, completely unprepared for a world that doesn't revolve around their comfort and success. Peterson shares the story of his own son's fascination with climbing increasingly tall structures around their neighborhood. Rather than constantly warning him down, Peterson learned to watch and assess when intervention was truly necessary versus when his son was engaged in essential learning. The boy wasn't being reckless. He was methodically expanding his competence, learning to read his own limits, and developing confidence in his physical abilities. But here's where Peterson's insight becomes truly profound. He argues that our interference with natural risk-taking isn't just overprotective, it's actually a form of resentment. Adults who have had their own spirits crushed by excessive safety and conformity often feel a bitter satisfaction in crushing the adventurous spirits of the young. We tell ourselves we're protecting them, but we're actually projecting our own fears and limitations onto their naturally expansive energy. The modern parallel is everywhere around us. We see it in schools that eliminate competitive sports to avoid hurting feelings, in universities that provide safe spaces from challenging ideas, in workplaces that prioritize comfort over growth. Each of these interventions, however well-intentioned, robs people of opportunities to develop genuine competence and resilience. Peterson isn't advocating for reckless endangerment or neglectful parenting. He's making a more subtle point about the difference between reasonable safety measures and the kind of overprotection that stunts development. The goal isn't to eliminate all risk, but to allow young people to engage with age-appropriate challenges that help them grow stronger and more capable. So the next time you see children skateboarding, climbing trees, or attempting something that makes you slightly nervous, resist the urge to immediately intervene. Ask yourself whether they're developing competence or courting genuine danger. More often than not, you'll discover that what looks like risky behavior is actually the essential work of growing up, and the most loving thing you can do is step back and let them learn. Picture this. You're walking down a busy street, your mind consumed with deadlines, bills, relationship problems, maybe even deeper existential questions about where your life is heading. The weight of the world sits heavy on your shoulders. Then suddenly, there's a cat, just sitting there on a sunny patch of sidewalk, completely unbothered by the chaos of human existence swirling around it. Jordan Peterson's 12th and final rule might seem almost whimsically simple at first glance, but like that unexpected feline encounter, it contains profound wisdom hiding in plain sight. When Peterson tells us to pet a cat when we encounter one on the street, he's not just talking about cats, of course. He's talking about something much more fundamental to the human experience: our ability to find beauty, meaning, and momentary relief in the smallest of life's offerings, especially when everything else seems to be falling apart. Think about this for a moment. How often do we rush past these tiny opportunities for joy because we're too caught up in our suffering to notice them? Peterson opens this chapter with a deeply personal story about his daughter Michaela's struggle with severe juvenile arthritis. Imagine watching your child suffer through dozens of joint replacements, constant pain, and a medical system that often seemed more interested in managing symptoms than finding real solutions. As a father, Peterson found himself in that terrible space that so many of us know all too well, where you feel helpless against forces much larger than yourself. The suffering wasn't just Michaela's. It radiated through the entire family, creating what he describes as a kind of concentrated hell that no amount of positive thinking could simply wish away. Now, here's where Peterson's insight becomes particularly powerful. He doesn't suggest that petting a cat, or finding these small moments of beauty, will somehow cure the arthritis or solve the fundamental problems. That would be naive and frankly insulting to anyone who's experienced real suffering. Instead, he's pointing to something more subtle and perhaps more profound: our human capacity to hold both suffering and beauty simultaneously, without one negating the other. Consider how this plays out in your own life. Maybe you're dealing with a difficult divorce, watching a parent struggle with dementia, or facing your own health challenges. The temptation is often to let that suffering color everything, to close ourselves off from small pleasures because they feel somehow inappropriate or insufficient in the face of real pain. But Peterson suggests this is exactly backwards. It's precisely when life is at its most difficult that we need these moments of transcendence most desperately. The cat becomes a symbol for what Peterson calls the small things that can sustain us. When you stop to pet that cat, you're not ignoring your problems or pretending they don't exist. You're acknowledging that even in the midst of genuine suffering, there are still moments when the universe reveals its underlying beauty and meaning. The cat's purr, the warmth of its fur, the simple fact that this creature trusts you enough to accept your touch, all of these become tiny islands of meaning in an ocean of chaos. This connects to something Peterson discusses throughout the book, the idea that meaning, not happiness, is what makes life bearable. Happiness is fleeting and often dependent on circumstances beyond our control. But meaning can be found even in the darkest moments, sometimes especially in the darkest moments. When you choose to notice the cat, to pause and engage with something beautiful despite your pain, you're making a small but significant statement about your values and your humanity. Think about how this applies to our modern world, where we're constantly bombarded with news of global crises, political turmoil, and environmental catastrophe. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, to think that small acts of noticing and appreciation are somehow frivolous in the face of such massive problems. But Peterson would argue the opposite. It's exactly because the problems are so large and complex that we need these moments of simple, direct connection with beauty and meaning. The practical wisdom here extends far beyond cats, of course. Maybe it's pausing to really listen to a piece of music that moves you, watching clouds drift across the sky, or having a genuine conversation with a stranger in line at the coffee shop. These aren't distractions from the serious business of life. They're what make the serious business of life worth engaging with in the first place. As we reach the end of Peterson's 12 rules, this final lesson feels like both a culmination and a beginning. It reminds us that all the personal responsibility, truth-telling, and meaning-making in the world still need to be grounded in our capacity for wonder and appreciation. Life will continue to present us with suffering, that's guaranteed. But it will also continue to offer us cats to pet, if we're paying attention. So the next time you encounter that cat on the street, literal or metaphorical, don't walk past. Stop, engage, and remember that these small moments of beauty aren't separate from the work of building a meaningful life. They are the work itself. Picture this. You're sitting across from a friend who's just had one of those profound realizations that makes everything click into place. That's exactly what Jordan Peterson experienced when he began to understand one of the most fundamental patterns governing human existence. As we settle deeper into our exploration of the 12 rules for life, we encounter what might be Peterson's most elegant and powerful framework for understanding reality itself, the eternal dance between chaos and order. Now think about this for a moment. What happens when your life becomes too predictable, too structured, too safe? You know that feeling, don't you? When every day blends into the next, when you're going through the motions, when that comfortable routine starts feeling more like a prison than a sanctuary. Peterson calls this excessive order, and while it provides security, it also breeds stagnation, boredom, and a kind of spiritual death. Your growth stops. Your potential withers. You become, in essence, a person sleepwalking through existence. But flip that coin, and chaos awaits on the other side. This isn't just the chaos of a messy room or a hectic schedule. Peterson is talking about something far more profound. Chaos is the realm of the unknown, the unpredictable, the territory where all our carefully laid plans crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. It's the phone call that changes everything, the opportunity that terrifies you, the crisis that strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself. Pure chaos is equally destructive because it offers no foundation, no stability, no place to stand and make sense of the world. Here's where Peterson's insight becomes brilliant. Life isn't about choosing between chaos and order. Life is about finding that sweet spot right at the border between them. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean, your feet planted firmly on solid ground but close enough that the waves occasionally wash over your toes. That's where you want to be, where you need to be, if you want to grow and thrive and become who you're capable of becoming. Peterson illustrates this with a story that's both ancient and utterly modern. Consider the mythological figure who ventures into the unknown, faces dragons, and returns with treasure. This isn't just some dusty fairy tale. It's a blueprint for human development that plays out in boardrooms and classrooms and relationships every single day. When you take on a challenging project at work, when you have that difficult conversation with your partner, when you push yourself to learn a new skill that makes you uncomfortable, you're literally enacting this timeless pattern. The treasure you bring back isn't gold or jewels, it's something far more valuable. Increased competence, deeper wisdom, expanded capacity to handle whatever life throws at you next. Every time you voluntarily step into the unknown and navigate your way through it, you become more resilient, more capable, more fully yourself. You're literally rewiring your brain, building new neural pathways that serve as bridges between the familiar territory of your past and the uncharted landscape of your future. But here's what makes this framework so practical and relevant to our modern lives. Think about the current moment we're living in, where technological change happens at breakneck speed, where career paths that existed 5 years ago are obsolete today, where the very nature of work and relationships and community is being constantly redefined. We're all living at that border between order and chaos, whether we choose to or not. The question becomes, are you going to be a passive victim of these changes, constantly thrown off balance by forces beyond your control? Or are you going to develop the skills and mindset to dance with uncertainty, to find stability not in external circumstances, but in your own ability to adapt and grow and learn? Peterson suggests that the people who thrive in this environment are those who have learned to tolerate ambiguity, to sit with discomfort, to see challenges not as threats to be avoided, but as invitations to become stronger. They've discovered that meaning isn't found in the destination, but in the journey itself, particularly in those moments when you're stretching beyond your current limitations. Consider how this plays out in something as simple as learning to cook a new cuisine. At first, everything is chaos. You can't pronounce the ingredients, the techniques are foreign, you burn things and create disasters. But gradually, patterns emerge. You develop intuition. What once seemed impossibly complex becomes second nature. You've transformed chaos into order through deliberate practice and patient persistence. More importantly, you've expanded your identity. You're no longer just someone who can make basic meals. You're someone who can navigate unfamiliar culinary territory. This same principle applies to every area of growth in your life. The key insight Peterson offers is that this process never ends. There's always another edge to explore, another dragon to face, another treasure to discover. And that's not a bug in the system of human existence, it's a feature. It's what keeps life interesting, meaningful, and worth living. As we prepare to dive deeper into the specific rules Peterson outlines, remember this foundational truth. You are most alive, most yourself, most fulfilled when you're consciously choosing to stand at that productive edge between the known and unknown. Picture this. You're sitting there with your coffee, maybe it's your third cup today, and you've just absorbed 12 profound rules that could genuinely transform your life. But here's the thing that happens to all of us, isn't it? We close the book, we feel inspired, maybe even a little overwhelmed, and then Monday morning hits. The alarm goes off, you're rushing to get ready, and suddenly those life-changing insights feel as distant as last year's New Year's resolutions. So how do we bridge that gap between inspiration and actual, tangible change in our daily lives? Peterson understands this challenge intimately. He spent decades not just as a clinical psychologist, but as someone who's watched countless people struggle with the chasm between knowing what's good for them and actually doing it. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you known exactly what you should do, but found yourself doing the complete opposite? It's like having a GPS that clearly shows the route, but somehow you keep taking the wrong turns anyway. The secret, Peterson suggests, isn't to attempt some dramatic overnight transformation. That's actually a recipe for failure, much like trying to deadlift 300 pounds on your first day at the gym. Instead, he advocates for what he calls micro-implementations, tiny, almost embarrassingly small steps that your brain won't rebel against. Let's say you want to clean up your life, literally and figuratively, following Rule 1 about standing up straight with your shoulders back. Don't start by reorganizing your entire house. Start with making your bed, just your bed. Every morning, without exception. Now you might be thinking, really, making my bed is going to change my life. But here's what Peterson has observed in his practice. When you make your bed, you're doing something profound. You're telling your unconscious mind that you believe the day ahead has potential, that you're worth the effort of creating order, even in this small way. It's like planting a seed of competence that grows throughout the day. One patient of his, a man struggling with severe depression, started with just this single act. 6 months later, he had not only maintained this habit but had gradually expanded it to organizing his entire living space, which correlated with significant improvements in his mental health. The key insight here is understanding what Peterson calls the momentum principle. Each small victory creates psychological momentum for the next slightly larger challenge. Think of it like a flywheel, those massive wheels in old factories that took enormous effort to get moving. But once they gained momentum, they could power entire machines with seemingly effortless grace. Your daily habits work exactly the same way. Let's get practical about Rule 2. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. How often do you take better care of your pet than yourself? Peterson tells the story of people who will rush their dog to the veterinarian at the first sign of illness, but will ignore their own symptoms for months. The implementation here isn't about grand gestures of self-care. Start by asking yourself this question every morning. What's one thing I can do today that my future self will thank me for? Maybe it's drinking an extra glass of water, taking your vitamins, or going to bed 15 minutes earlier. The magic isn't in the action itself. It's in consistently asking the question and following through. For Rule 3 about choosing your friends wisely, the implementation requires honest self-reflection that might sting a little. Peterson suggests doing what he calls the energy audit. After spending time with different people in your life, pay attention to how you feel. Do you feel energized, inspired, more capable? Or do you feel drained, cynical, or smaller somehow? This isn't about judging others harshly. It's about recognizing that we become who we spend time with, whether we realize it or not. One of his clients discovered that her Sunday family dinners, which she attended out of obligation, were consistently leaving her depressed for days afterward. The solution wasn't to cut off her family entirely, but to limit exposure and create boundaries that protected her psychological well-being. The beautiful thing about Peterson's approach is that he doesn't ask you to become someone completely different overnight. He's asking you to become slightly more yourself, the version of yourself that you'd be proud to be. When implementing Rule 12 about paying attention to small things, start by noticing one beautiful thing each day. It might be the way morning light hits your coffee cup, or how your child laughs, or the satisfying click of a perfectly working pen. This isn't about forced positivity. It's about training your brain to notice what's already there. Remember, the goal isn't perfection. It's progress. Peterson often reminds us that we're aiming to be better today than we were yesterday, not better than everyone else. These rules aren't meant to be implemented all at once like some kind of life overhaul program. They're meant to be lived, gradually and consistently, until they become as natural as breathing. And that journey, my friend, begins with your very next choice, your very next action, your very next moment of deciding to take responsibility for the trajectory of your own life. Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life isn't just a self-help book. It's a profound exploration of what it means to live with purpose in a chaotic world. Through ancient wisdom, psychological insights, and unflinching honesty about life's inevitable suffering, Peterson offers us a roadmap not to happiness, but to meaning. The book's central message is revolutionary in its simplicity. By taking responsibility for ourselves and our immediate surroundings, we can create order from chaos and find significance in our struggles. Each rule builds upon the others, forming a comprehensive philosophy of personal responsibility, courage, and growth. Peterson doesn't promise easy answers or quick fixes. Instead, he asks us to stand up straight, clean our rooms, tell the truth, and treat ourselves and others with the dignity we all deserve. These aren't just behavioral suggestions. They're invitations to transform how we see ourselves and our place in the world. Here are the key takeaways to carry forward. Start incredibly small with personal responsibility. Don't try to save the world before you've organized your own life. Clean your room literally and metaphorically. When your immediate environment is in order, you'll be amazed how this clarity extends outward. Begin with one small area today, your desk, your closet, or even just making your bed. This isn't about perfection. It's about creating a foundation of order you can build upon. Treat yourself as someone you're responsible for helping. You'd move heaven and earth to help a friend, yet you often neglect your own well-being. Start asking, what would be truly good for me? Not what feels good in the moment, but what serves your long-term flourishing. Schedule that doctor's appointment, say no to that toxic relationship, invest in your growth. Be patient with yourself, but also be your own advocate. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. This goes deeper than honesty with others. It starts with radical honesty with yourself. Stop pretending you don't know what you need to do. Stop making excuses for behaviors that harm you. When you speak, let your words align with your deepest values. Start small. Notice when you're tempted to lie, even in tiny ways, and choose truth instead. Stand up straight and face life courageously. Your posture reflects your relationship with existence itself. When you stand tall, you signal to yourself and the world that you're ready to take on responsibility and meaning. Practice this literally, shoulders back, head up, but also metaphorically. Face your problems directly rather than avoiding them. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. The easy path rarely leads to fulfillment. Instead of asking, what can I get away with? Ask, what can I contribute? Choose the harder path that builds character over the easier one that provides temporary pleasure. This might mean having difficult conversations, doing work that challenges you, or sacrificing short-term comfort for long-term growth. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.